James K. Polk is regarded as one of the most underrated presidents in American history. His reputation has had something of a resurgence in recent years, thanks to the fact that he achieved what few politicians can claim. He kept all of his campaign promises. A protege of Andrew Jackson, Polk was elected to the House of Representatives in 1825 to represent the city of Memphis. He soon rose through the ranks to eventually become Speaker of the House. A dark horse candidate, he won the Democratic Party's nomination for president. He won the 1844 election in a close contest against Whig candidate Henry Clay. Polk campaigned to lower tariffs and to promote westward expansion. Expansion was an important plank within the Democratic Party's platform in order to fulfill the agrarian dream of Thomas Jefferson. To achieve this goal, Polk needed to secure the Oregon Country from Britain as well as Texas and California from Mexico. Annexation of Texas had been delayed for a decade due to fears of disunion as well as provoking a fight with Mexico. Polk insisted that Texas should be re-annexed, in his words, and so sent troops down to the Nueces River to provoke a fight with Mexico. A skirmish broke out, and Polk used this as the justification needed to declare war on Mexico, which Congress did on May 13, 1846. The war was divisive from the beginning. Democrats both North and South supported the war, while most Whigs opposed it. During this era, John O. Sullivan's Democratic Review was a major mouthpiece for the Democratic Party and for Manifest Destiny. This was the belief that Americans were divinely entitled to settle the entire North American continent. As he said in the review, quote, "Our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." The Whigs had different ideas on where to take the nation. As the party of manufacturing and nationalism, the Whigs believed that annexing Texas and California would tip the balance of power once again in the hands of the slave owners. This would upset the balance of power in Congress and would lead the nation further down the road to disunion. The Whigs also believed that populations living as far away as Oregon and California would not want to be ruled by a federal government based all the way in Washington, D.C. This was the fear predicted by the Kennebec Journal, a pro-Whig newspaper. As Ulysses S. Grant famously shared this sentiment when he wrote that the war was, quote, "the most unjust war ever waged." Congressman and former President John Quincy Adams was one of the first to expose the war as a means of expanding the power of the slaveholders in the South at the expense of the North. He was one of only 13 representatives to vote a no on a verbal vote for the war when it came to the floor. Writers like Henry David Thoreau refused to pay his taxes to fund the war and was forced to spend time in prison. Despite the opposition, the war was mostly popular with the general public. The anti-slavery movement was still small to the lament of Frederick Douglass, and there was still a strong urge to move westward. Nonetheless, populations in New England began to believe that the South was on the verge of overpowering the rest of the nation. In addition, there lay the possibility that Mexico could repel an invasion. Technological innovations had allowed for news of war to reach home fronts faster than ever before. News of the carnage galvanized Whig voters who would turn out in a fighting chance to defeat the hegemonic Democratic Party. Coming into the elections, things weren't looking too good for the Whig Party as a whole. The Democrats had a huge majority over the Whigs, with 142 seats in the House to the Whigs' 70 seats. The Know-Nothings, a nativist anti-Catholic party, had 6 seats and 3 independents in the House. The Whigs were led by Robert Charles Winthrop of the Massachusetts 1st District, which comprised mostly of Boston. Like all good Whigs, Winthrop came from the New England aristocracy, and he was a direct descendant of John Winthrop, one of the founders of the Plymouth Colony. Democrats, meanwhile, were led by Lynn Boyd of Kentucky's 1st District. Unlike today, there was no fixed election day for the election of Congress. Instead, election day would vary from state to state, and some states would not hold elections until after the new Congress was assembled. However, thanks to inventions such as the telegraph, the uniform date of choosing presidential electors was eventually decided, and slowly the same trend would happen to the selecting of representatives to the House. In this election, all 230 seats were up for grabs. 116 seats were needed to win a majority. In this election, Texas and Iowa voted for congressmen for the first time. Both states were won by Democrats. On August 2nd, Missouri held its election and returned 5 Democrats and no Whigs to the House. The next day, Illinois and Arkansas held their elections. Arkansas's at-large district returned a Democrat, and 6 Democrats won in Illinois, and 1 Whig named Abraham Lincoln won for his territory of Springfield. During his one-term tenure, Lincoln would propose spot resolutions, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil, the line Polk had used to justify going to war against Mexico. Vermont held its election on September 1st and returned 1 Democrat and 4 Whigs. Maine held theirs on September 14th and returned 6 Democrats and 1 Whig. Florida and Georgia held theirs on October 5th. Florida returned 1 Whig, to the surprise of many, given that Florida during this time was a heavily Democratic state. Georgia was split down the middle, returning 4 Democrats and 4 Whigs. South Carolina, reliably blue, returned 7 Democrats and 0 Whigs. Ohio and Pennsylvania held their elections on October 13th. Pennsylvania returned 7 Democrats and 16 Whigs, as well as 1 know-nothing. This was a 6-seat swing for the Whigs in Pennsylvania. Ohio returned 10 Democrats and 11 Whigs, who won a net gain of 3 seats. Michigan, New Jersey, and New York held their elections on November 3rd. Michigan returned 3 Democrats, no Whigs. New Jersey returned 1 Democrat and 4 Whigs. New York, the largest state in the Union, returned 23 Whigs and 11 Democrats. That was 14 seats gained by the Whigs. All 4 know-nothings in the previous Congress had lost their seats. Massachusetts, a longtime Whig hotspot, returned 10 Whigs, 0 Democrats. Delaware, which held its election on November 10th, returned 1 Whig. On March 4th, 1847, the 30th Congress met. However, elections continued in the remaining states. New Hampshire, a swing state then, as it is now, held its election on March 9th and elected 2 Democrats and 1 Whig and 1 independent named Amos Tuck, who would later help found the Republican Party. Connecticut elected 4 Whigs and no Democrats. Rhode Island elected 1 Democrat and 1 Whig, and this was actually a gain for the Democrats. Virginia held its election on April 22nd, and 9 Democrats were elected to 6 Whigs. This was a 5-seat net gain for the Whigs. In Alabama, elections were held on August 2nd, and 5 Democrats won and 2 Whigs won. Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee held their elections on August 2nd. Indiana returned 6 Democrats and 4 Whigs. Thus, this was a 2-seat net gain. Kentucky returned 4 Democrats and 6 Whigs, even though the Democrats had gained 1 seat. Tennessee returned 6 Democrats and 5 Whigs. North Carolina held their elections on August 5th, and this was a major upset. Only 3 Democrats were elected, while 6 Whigs were elected. This was a 3-seat net gain for the Whigs. Maryland held their election on October 6th and returned 2 Democrats and 4 Whigs, which was a 2-seat net gain for the Whig Party. Mississippi, which recently changed from an at-large district to 4 districts, returned 3 Democrats and 1 Whig. And finally, Louisiana returned 3 Democrats and 1 Whig. The Whig Party had won a majority of seats, but only just. It won 116 seats, the exact number needed to win an all-out majority. There was a net gain of 37 seats. The Democrats won 110 seats. They suffered a net loss of 32 seats. The Know-Nothings won 1 seat after losing 5 seats, and 3 independents were elected. Despite winning the elections, the Whigs actually lost the popular vote. Democrats won 1,124,080 votes, or 48.43% of the vote. The Whigs, meanwhile, won 1,033,506 votes, or 44.5% of the vote. The Know-Nothings won 28,198 votes, or 1.2% of the vote, and independents won 63,690 votes, or 2.7% of the popular vote. All parties suffered in terms of a swing of votes compared to the last election. The general state of the parties were not good, and both voters on both sides of the aisle felt disillusioned with the political system. The Whigs saw a 0.2% swing away from them, and the Democrats saw the biggest hit of 1.6 swing away from them. This would be the last election the Whig Party would ever win, and despite winning, they would continue to fund the Mexican-American War until its successful conclusion for the United States.